It is April 1945. A German village near Augsburg stands quiet under a gray spring sky. American forward troops enter the muddy square of Mittelbach, their boots crunching on wet gravel. They expect a routine sweep, but instead they encounter a scene of absolute horror. 8 local civilians lie dead on the stones around an old well, their bodies stained a distinct, deep blue, and their mouths covered in white foam. 12 more villagers lie writhing on the ground nearby, clutching their stomachs and weeping in agony. The retreating enemy had chosen to turn a common water source into a lethal weapon. General George S. Patton would soon discover this atrocity, and his response would ensure that the man who designed this calculated cruelty would face the ultimate reckoning before a rope could find his neck. This is the story of what General Patton did when enemy officers forced innocent civilians to drink cyanide-poisoned water as a safety demonstration, and how he hunted the specialized doctor responsible. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show how some weapons require a soldier to break first. Captain Daniel Wilson was 34 years old, a medical officer from Detroit, Michigan, serving with a forward medical detachment. Before the war, he had practiced medicine for 8 long years, treating the routine ailments of working-class families in the Midwest. For the past 18 months, however, his hands had been covered in the blood of young Americans torn apart by artillery shells and landmines. He believed he had grown numb to the worst sights of the European theater. Yet, looking down at the foaming mouths and blue-tinted skin of the dead civilians in Mittelbach, he realized his medical training had not prepared him for absolute malice. He immediately fell to his knees in the mud, opening his medical kit to administer activated charcoal, and induced vomiting to the 12 villagers, who were still breathing, determined to snatch them back from the edge of the grave. Standing on the other side of this tragedy was SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Baumgartner, a 41-year-old SS officer and doctor from Berlin, Germany. Baumgartner had received his medical degree from the prestigious University of Berlin before joining the SS in 1934, choosing to use his scientific knowledge to serve a regime of hatred. By 1942, he was working at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, conducting brutal human experiments on prisoners that reduced medical science to a tool of torture. When the Eastern Front began to crumble, he was transferred to specialized combat units to oversee denial operations, which meant ensuring that the advancing Allies inherited nothing but scorched earth and poisoned soil. He wore a perfectly tailored uniform. His boots shined to a high gloss despite the muddy retreat, and on his chest pinned the Iron Cross, a symbol of a career built entirely on unearned privilege and calculated slaughter. He had already poisoned 14 wells across the Western Front, viewing the agonizing deaths of 80 American soldiers as mere data in his ledger. The Allied armies were surging across southern Germany in April 1945, pushing through a shattered landscape where the German army was collapsing in chaos. Command structures had completely dissolved, supply lines were severed, and the retreating forces resorted to desperate tactics to slow down the unstoppable American advance. In this atmosphere of lawlessness and ruin, retreating units routinely left behind traps, mines, and ruined infrastructure. Many American officers had grown accustomed to blown bridges and blocked roads, letting the destruction slide as an inevitable byproduct of a brutal war. They focused heavily on moving forward, treating these obstacles as routine military challenges rather than deliberate violations of the laws of combat. But the poisoning of communal water supplies crossed a line that transformed standard tactical delay into something far more sinister. The enemy had realized that advanced units relied heavily on local infrastructure, and a poisoned well could disable an entire battalion without a single shot being fired. Commanders along the line had seen casualties rise from mysterious illnesses, yet they often chalked it up to bad rations or poor sanitation in the field. This collective hesitation allowed specialized units to operate with impunity, turning the basic necessity of water into a widespread chemical battlefield trap. The tragedy at Mittelbach finally pulled back the curtain on this hidden campaign, forcing the American command to look directly at the calculated malice waiting for them in the wells. Captain Wilson stood by the stone wall, looking at the evidence that would change how the army viewed the retreat. Captain Wilson bent over the village elder, 78-year-old Herr Maximilian Krause of Mittelbach, who was coughing violently, What did they do to you? Wilson asked. The SS unit arrived 12 hours ago, Krause said, his voice shaking. They put a powder into our stone well. Did they say what it was? Wilson asked. The commander laughed. Krause said, spitting yellow bile onto the dirt. He said it was a demonstration of water purity for the Americans. They forced 20 of us to drink it at gunpoint to prove it was safe. Wilson looked at the blue faces of the 8 dead nearby. Who was the officer? He asked. A doctor, Krause whispered, Major Baumgartner. He watched them die and wrote notes in a small book. Then he ordered his trucks to drive east. An American infantry lieutenant walked over, holding a canteen full of the well water. We need to clear this area for the main column, the lieutenant said. Do not touch that water, Wilson said. It is laced with a heavy concentration of cyanide solution. The lieutenant stepped back, his face turning pale. Are you sure? Doc, look at the bodies, Wilson said. It is a mass casualty trap meant for our forward troops. If the villagers had not warned us, our men would have filled their canteens here. The lieutenant swore softly. The local commander told us to expect normal sabotage, not this. This is not normal sabotage, Wilson said, capping a glass specimen vial containing the poisoned water. This is an organized medical atrocity. We have to report this up the chain immediately, the lieutenant said. Wilson filled out a field medical report, attaching the preliminary chemical test results and the detailed statement from Krause. He handed the papers to a motorcycle courier. Take this directly to 3rd Army headquarters, Wilson ordered. The courier kicked his starter, the engine roaring to life in the quiet square. The detailed report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour, his jeep screeching to a halt near the stone well. He climbed out unannounced, wearing his immaculate full uniform with 4 stars shining under the gray sky, his ivory revolvers resting against his hips. Every soldier in the square stood at rigid attention as the general walked directly toward Captain Wilson. Show me the report, Patton said. Wilson handed over the clipboard, watching the general read the details of the cyanide poisoning. Patton did not raise his voice, but his jaw tightened. Where is this officer now? Patton asked. 60 kilometers ahead. Moving east, Wilson answered. Patton turned his sharp eyes toward Major Lieberman, his intelligence officer who had just arrived in a separate vehicle. Major, I want this doctor. He has been poisoning wells for 6 weeks, killing our men and using civilians as test subjects. He is your top priority, authorized for high-priority pursuit and capture. Yes, sir, Lieberman said. The search was relentless, utilizing a specialized chemical warfare team to track the retreating SS unit. Within 36 hours, Lieberman surrounded Baumgartner near a village 80 kilometers away, capturing the doctor just as he was preparing to poison another water supply. They transported the prisoner back to a secure holding facility, where Wilson sat across from him in a small room. You are a trained physician, Wilson said. Why did you force civilians to drink poison? The war is over, Baumgartner answered, his voice completely calm. My work is fully documented, so there is no point in concealing the methodology. I am a scientist, and even my failures are useful data. You watched them die to test a trap for our soldiers, Wilson said. It was a logical military operation to secure our retreat, Baumgartner replied, adjusting his clean cuffs. The subjects were simply available. Patton entered the room, his boots clicking on the concrete floor. He stood over the seated SS officer, looking down with cold contempt. You think you are a scientist, Patton said. You believe your medical degree grants you the authority to turn a village well into a laboratory. A real doctor saves lives, but you used your training to murder innocent people and trap American soldiers. You are not a scientist. You are a common killer with a piece of paper from Berlin. The war is a matter of mathematics, Baumgartner said. The mathematics have changed, Patton answered. You have 2 options. You will write down every single location you poisoned, or you will face immediate, public execution by hanging in the center of the next town we liberate. Decide now. Baumgartner looked into Patton's unblinking eyes, realizing the general was entirely serious. He picked up a pen and began to write. The detailed list provided by Baumgartner allowed the American forces to immediately secure the 14 contaminated sites before any more troops could drink from them. Once the wells were safe, the verdict was executed swiftly and without any further negotiation. Under the direct orders of Patton, military MPs marched Baumgartner back to the muddy village square of Mittelbach, right to the edge of the stone well where the atrocity had taken place. A large wooden scaffold had been erected beside the water source, towering over the stones. Baumgartner walked up the wooden steps, his polished boots clicking on the rough planks, while hundreds of local civilians and American soldiers watched in absolute silence. He could smell the damp earth, the fresh pine wood of the gallows, and the faint, bitter scent of chemical residue still lingering near the well. The village elder, Herr Krause, stood at the front of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the man who had murdered his neighbors. The executioner placed the heavy hemp rope around the SS doctor's neck, securing the knot firmly behind his ear. There were no final speeches, no reading of long charges, and no grand gestures from the officers in charge. The trapdoor snapped open with a sharp crack, and Baumgartner dropped into the darkness of his own design. Captain Daniel Wilson returned to Detroit after the war, resuming his medical practice with a deep focus on emergency medicine and toxicology at Henry Ford Hospital. He spent the next 50 years studying the long-term effects of chemical exposure, frequently consulting on post-war security incidents and industrial accidents based on the dark knowledge he had gathered in Germany. He lived a quiet, dedicated life helping his community until his death in 1995. The village elder, Herr Maximilian Krause, remained in Mittelbach for the rest of his days, watching his community slowly rebuild from the scars of the occupation. He lived until 1972, serving as a living bridge to the past and ensuring that the story of that April morning was never buried by time. General Patton kept the original interrogation transcript and the final report on the Mittelbach well poisoning locked inside a personal desk drawer for the remainder of his life. He never spoke about the incident during his rare press conferences, preferring to let the sudden disappearance of the S-poisoning unit speak for itself. In a private letter to his wife, written a few weeks after the execution, he noted that some men lose their minds in the wilderness of defeat, but a commander must always hold the line against monsters. He wrote that a man who uses water as a blade deserves to feel the weight of his own iron. The documentation Wilson compiled during those frantic hours in the mud eventually found its way into military archives, stripped of its emotional weight and reduced to cold technical data. It became a foundational piece of study for tactical defense, proving that swift, decisive investigation could neutralize unconventional threats before they destroyed an army. Some historians argue that Patton's use of summary military justice and the immediate threat of execution bypassed the established legal channels of the military court system, setting a dangerous precedent for field commanders during the chaotic final weeks of the European War. Others argue that the rapid deployment of a specialized counter-threat unit was the only effective way to neutralize a highly active chemical saboteur who was actively poisoning civilian infrastructure and killing advancing troops. What is certain is that the 14th well was the final water source contaminated by the retreating SS doctor, and the captured documentation provided a crucial baseline for post-war chemical defense protocols. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have turned the doctor over to a civilian tribunal for trial? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about how some weapons require a soldier to break first, make sure to subscribe.